They said the crying started before the fire. Not loud, not desperate, just steady, like a child who had already learned no one was coming. On the night of October 3rd, 1847, the Whitmore plantation house burned from the inside out. No lightning, no raid, no witnesses brave enough to admit what they saw. The flames moved strangely, slow at first, then rising in thin columns as if guided by unseen hands. By dawn, the house was a hollow shell of blackened wood and twisted iron. Inside the nursery, investigators found 3 small beds untouched by flame, and 1 rocking chair, still warm. The Whitmore family had vanished. No bodies, no tracks leading away, only ash and the faint smell of something sweet beneath the smoke. But the strangest detail was not the fire. It was the woman who survived. Her name was Eliza Ward. She had been enslaved on the Whitmore plantation for 16 years. The records listed her as a field hand. But the townspeople knew differently. They whispered that she had been moved into the main house years before the fire, that she had been given a strange duty, to raise the Whitmore children, not as a nanny, not as a servant, but as something closer. When soldiers questioned her, Eliza did not weep. She did not tremble. She simply said, "They are where they belong." No one pressed her further. In those days, truth was expensive. Silence was cheaper. But buried beneath plantation ledgers and church records was a story too disturbing to remain hidden forever. A story of control disguised as kindness, of faith twisted into obedience, of children raised under a doctrine no one dared question, and of a truth that did not burn with the house. It waited. It waited for years. When Henry Whitmore purchased Eliza in 1831, he made an unusual note in the margin of the sale ledger. Suitable for refinement. Plantation owners did not write things like that. Henry Whitmore was not known as a cruel man. That is how histories often describe men like him. He donated to the church. He funded the town schoolhouse. He quoted scripture at Sunday gatherings. His wife, Margaret, suffered from a lingering illness after the birth of their second child. Some said it was weakness of the lungs. Others whispered it was something darker, melancholia that left her staring at walls for hours. Within months of Eliza's arrival, Margaret retreated completely from public view. The children did not. Neighbors noticed something odd. The Whitmore children did not play with others. They did not laugh loudly. They did not cry in public. When spoken to, they answered in unison. "Yes, Father." No childish tone. No defiance. Just rehearsed calm. Eliza was rarely seen outside the house after that first year. She was no longer listed among the field hands. Church records began marking her presence in the Whitmore pew on Sundays, but seated directly behind the children, never beside them. A former cook would later confess that Henry had given Eliza a new role. She was to raise his children without weakness, to remove fear, to remove softness, to remove what he called inherited sin. He believed children were born corrupt. He believed they needed to be emptied before they could be filled. And Eliza, bound by chains both physical and invisible, was ordered to carry out that vision. She taught them silence before speech, stillness before comfort, obedience before identity. But something happened inside that house that Henry Whitmore did not anticipate. Children learn what they are shown, and Eliza had learned things long before she stepped onto that plantation. Things older than Henry's faith, older than the town, older than the house that would one day burn. The nursery walls were painted pale blue, but the windows were always covered. Not nailed shut, just draped in thick fabric that kept out the sun. Eliza began each morning before dawn. The children were made to stand barefoot on cold wooden floors while she recited passages, not from the family Bible, but from memory, softly, rhythmically, words that were never written down. The children were told to repeat after her, not the words, the silence between them. According to a diary recovered decades later, Henry had instructed her to break their will gently. No shouting, no bruises that could be seen. Discipline was to be internal. Isolation, whispered correction, withdrawal of affection. When the youngest boy cried for his mother, Eliza did not comfort him. She knelt to his level and told him, "Your mother is the house now. The house sees you." After that, he stopped crying. Margaret Whitmore died quietly in 1842. Official cause, fever. Unofficially, she had not left her bed in months. Some believed she heard the lessons through the walls. Some believed she understood what was happening. After her burial, Henry intensified the routine. He stopped allowing the children outdoors entirely. Visitors were told they were fragile. Eliza became their only constant presence. Years later, townsfolk would recall how the children began to look alike, not in features, but in expression, their eyes fixed, distant, as though watching something no one else could see. And then came the change. The oldest daughter began speaking in her sleep. Not English, not any language recognized by the pastor who was summoned in secret. Henry ordered Eliza to stop whatever she was teaching. Eliza responded with the same calm she had always carried. I only teach them what survives. 3 months later, the fire began. But the fire was not the beginning. It was the release. The investigation lasted 12 days. That was longer than most cases involving enslaved people at the time. But this was different. The Whitmores were respected, wealthy, connected to men in state government. Their disappearance demanded explanation. The plantation grounds were searched, wells drained, nearby woods combed by men with rifles and dogs. Nothing. No remains in the rubble. No sign of struggle. No footprints beyond those of the responding townsfolk. Eliza was found sitting beneath an oak tree at the edge of the property when soldiers arrived. Her dress smelled faintly of smoke, but her skin was untouched. "Where is Mr. Whitmore?" they demanded. She looked toward the ruins and said, "He asked for cleansing." It was written off as hysteria. Eliza was jailed briefly, then transferred to another estate 50 miles south. There was no formal charge, no trial. Her testimony was dismissed as incoherent. But rumors spread. A stable hand claimed he saw figures standing in the upstairs windows as the house burned, perfectly still, watching the flames rise around them. The pastor who had visited months earlier refused to speak publicly again. He resigned his position within the year and left town without farewell. Church attendance dropped. The Whitmore land was sold, but no family stayed long. Workers complained of hearing footsteps inside rooms that no longer existed, of children whispering from the fields at dusk. Within 10 years, the plantation stood abandoned, overgrown, forgotten, except by those who kept the records. And someone had kept them very carefully. Because in 1913, nearly 70 years after the fire, a sealed trunk surfaced in the basement of the old county courthouse. Inside were documents no one expected to find, and a letter signed in Henry Whitmore's own hand, dated the day before the fire. The letter was addressed not to family, nor to church, but to the town council. It began with a sentence that chilled the clerk who first unfolded it. "I have succeeded beyond expectation." Henry described his children as emptied vessels. He wrote of purification, of removing inherited weakness through controlled deprivation and ritual instruction. He thanked Eliza for her discipline and credited her with achieving what he could not. But the final paragraph shifted. Henry wrote that the children had begun speaking truths not placed within them, that they described spaces inside the house that did not exist when it was built, that they spoke of a presence beneath the floorboards, patient and older than Scripture. He claimed Eliza had not taught this. He claimed something else had answered. The letter ended abruptly. "They no longer require me." The trunk also contained sketches drawn in a child's hand, repeating symbols, circles within squares, a house with no doors. Historians debated whether the letter was authentic. Some argued it was fabrication meant to dramatize a tragic accident, but others noticed something impossible to ignore. The ink matched other Whitmore documents. The handwriting was verified, and buried in census records from 1850, 3 names appeared in a nearby county. Children matching the ages of the Whitmore sons and daughter, living under a different surname, listed as orphaned, with no guardian recorded. As for Eliza Ward, there is no death certificate, no burial record, no sale ledger marking her transfer. After 1847, she disappears completely from official history. But in towns stretching across the southern states, stories persisted, of children raised without mothers, of houses that listened, and of a woman who taught silence so deeply that even fire could not undo it. In 1851, for years after the Whitmore fire, a small church-run orphanage opened in a remote settlement known as Black Hollow, near the Georgia-Alabama border. It was funded quietly. No public dedication, no celebratory sermon, just a transfer of land through a private donor whose name appeared only as H.W. The orphanage housed 9 children in its first year. 3 of them arrived together. They gave their names as Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas Hale. They did not cry when separated. They did not ask questions. They did not blink often. Church records describe them as exceptionally obedient. They followed instruction without hesitation. They slept without complaint. They ate slowly, deliberately, as though timing each movement. But the other children began changing around them. Within months, the younger orphans stopped speaking at night. They reported dreams of a house with covered windows, a woman's voice guiding them through dark hallways, a man standing outside the nursery door, listening. The orphanage director, Reverend Caleb Moore, documented these disturbances carefully. He noted that the Hale children gathered in corners during free time, sitting in perfect stillness, not whispering, not playing, just sitting, watching. When questioned, Samuel once replied, "We are practicing." "Practicing what?" the Reverend asked. "Leaving," Samuel answered. In the winter of 1853, 2 children vanished from Black Hollow. No signs of escape. No tracks in the snow. Their beds were neatly made. The Hale siblings were found awake in the common room, seated side by side, facing the wall. They claimed they heard nothing. But Reverend Moore wrote something in the margins of his final journal entry. They do not fear punishment. They do not fear death. They behave as if they have already stepped beyond consequence. That journal ends abruptly. The orphanage closed the following year, and the Hale children were transferred again. Always together. Always silent. By the late 1860s, rumors of an unusual teaching method began circulating among rural seminaries in the South. It was never officially named, but students referred to it as the Doctrine of Emptiness. The philosophy suggested that human will was a flaw, that individuality disrupted divine order, that children should be stripped of desire early, before personality hardened into rebellion. Some traced its roots to obscure Puritan writings. Others whispered it began with a plantation owner who tried to perfect obedience. In 1872, a theological conference in Mississippi quietly condemned the doctrine. Not publicly. There were no pamphlets or sermons, but in private letters between pastors. They warned of infiltration by quiet influence. One letter mentioned 3 adult siblings traveling between towns, offering guidance to struggling congregations. Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas Hale. They were described as calm, persuasive, intensely composed. Congregations that welcomed them reported immediate changes. Services grew quieter, confessions more frequent, children more compliant. Parents praised the transformation at first. Then came the sleepwalking. Entire households reported waking to find their children standing in doorways at night, eyes open, faces expressionless. When shaken awake, the children said they were listening for instruction. To whom? They could not say. In one town, a mother claimed her daughter described a woman sitting at the foot of her bed, humming softly. The description matched no one local, but older residents who remembered the Whitmore plantation said the woman sounded familiar. The Hale siblings denied any wrongdoing. They insisted they only taught discipline. They insisted they had been taught young. And when pressed about their past, they offered the same answer every time. We were raised properly. By the 1880s, the siblings vanished from records again. But the doctrine did not. It resurfaced quietly in institutions built to shape young minds. Orphanages, reform schools, religious boarding academies, places where obedience was valued above all else, places where children could be remade. In 1891, workers demolishing the remains of the original Whitmore estate made a discovery beneath the foundation. A hollow space, not a cellar, not a storage pit, a carefully carved chamber, accessible only through a narrow crawl space hidden beneath what had once been the nursery floor. Inside, they found soot-blackened walls covered in symbols matching the sketches discovered decades earlier. Circles within squares, a house without doors, and dozens of small handprints pressed into dried clay. The prints were layered over time, some tiny, some larger. The workers reported feeling unsteady inside the chamber. One man refused to return after claiming he heard breathing beneath the earth. No human remains were found, but in the center of the chamber stood a wooden chair. Burned, not by the house fire. The scorch marks were older. County officials sealed the site quickly. The discovery was never widely reported. The land was declared unsafe for development and left untouched. But an architect hired to examine the structure wrote privately to a colleague. The chamber predates the Whitmore house by several decades. The foundation was built around it. In other words, Henry Whitmore had not built something new. He had built over something old, something already there. Historians later speculated that enslaved laborers might have created the chamber in secret, but the symbols did not match known cultural markings from West African traditions, nor did they match Christian iconography. They were simple, repetitive, almost childlike, as if drawn by hands learning shape for the first time. And yet they appeared with mathematical precision. The architect's final note reads, "If the children were taught to empty themselves, perhaps this chamber was meant to fill them." After 1891, locals avoided the property entirely. They claimed that on certain nights, faint light could be seen beneath the earth, not flickering like fire, steady, waiting. By 1918, the small community nearest the old Whitmore land had shrunk dramatically. Families moved away. Churches merged. The schoolhouse closed due to declining enrollment. But census records reveal something unsettling. Birth rates remained steady. Children were being born. They simply weren't staying. Between 1905 and 1917, 12 children from the area were reported missing. No kidnappings confirmed. No bodies recovered. Most cases were dismissed as runaway incidents. But interviews conducted decades later with elderly residents revealed a pattern. Each missing child had attended private tutoring sessions hosted by a traveling instructor. A woman described only as Ms. Ward. No official teaching credentials. No permanent residence. Just references from local pastors. She specialized in discipline, in focus, in removing excess imagination. Parents who hired her reported immediate improvement in behavior. Children became quieter, more helpful, more distant. And then, one by one, some disappeared. When questioned, Ms. Ward always provided the same explanation. They have gone where they are needed. The name Eliza Ward had long faded from local memory. But some elders swore the tutor resembled sketches of a woman connected to the Whitmore tragedy decades earlier. She would have been over 80 by then. Yet witnesses described her as ageless. Not young, not old, just unchanged. Authorities attempted to locate her in 1919. No birth certificate, no death record, no photograph, only signatures in church guest books stretching back nearly 70 years. Always the same handwriting, always steady, always controlled. The investigation ended quietly. The town eventually stopped filing reports. It became easier to believe the children ran away. Easier than considering the alternative. That someone was still teaching, still emptying, still guiding them somewhere beneath the surface of history. In 1934, a small theological seminary in northern Louisiana experienced an event that remains officially classified as a mass hysteria episode. 23 students awoke on the same night and walked barefoot into the central chapel. They arranged themselves in rows. They did not speak. They did not respond to faculty attempts to intervene. For 6 hours, they stood facing the pulpit. At sunrise, they collapsed simultaneously. Medical examinations found no toxins, no signs of illness. When questioned individually, the students described the same experience. A voice instructing them to gather, not commanding, inviting. One student claimed he saw a woman seated in the front pew before losing consciousness. She was humming. The melody, when later reconstructed, matched a rhythm recorded in Reverend Moore's 1853 journal from the Black Hollow Orphanage. The seminary board conducted a private inquiry. They discovered that a guest lecturer had visited weeks prior, a quiet instructor specializing in behavioral purification. Her name on record, E. Ward. She had delivered a single lecture titled The Discipline of Silence. There was no transcript, no recording, only a note from the dean stating, "She speaks with authority beyond her station." After the incident, the seminary dismissed the event publicly. Stress, religious fervor, youthful susceptibility. But 5 of the affected students withdrew permanently. 3 later founded reform schools emphasizing strict behavioral control. One became a traveling revival preacher advocating for the removal of self from faith. The pattern persisted. Institutions shaping young minds. Children and adolescents trained toward emptiness. And always, somewhere nearby, a quiet woman guiding the process. By 1950, references to Eliza Ward, or E. Ward, ceased entirely. No more guest books. No more signatures. No more sightings. But the doctrine she carried had already rooted itself deeply. Not as myth, not as legend, but as practice. Passed down, refined, hidden within the structures designed to raise the next generation. And if the Whitmore children truly survived the fire, if they were the first vessels emptied and refilled, then the question is not whether they escaped the flames. The question is what they carried forward, and whether the silence they were taught is still echoing in places we call safe. In 1952, 2 years after the last known reference to Ward, a graduate researcher at Tulane University began cataloging uncategorized church documents donated from rural parishes. His name was Daniel Harper. He was not looking for ghosts. He was researching post-war shifts in Southern theology. But inside a misfiled wooden crate labeled Agricultural Correspondence, he found something else. 47 letters. Different towns. Different decades. Same handwriting. The signature varied slightly. Eliza Ward. E. Ward. L. Ward. But the formation of the letters never changed. Perfectly balanced. Measured. Calm. The content was more disturbing. Parents thanking her for correcting their children. Pastors praising her guidance in strengthening young spirits. Directors of orphanages reporting remarkable compliance improvements after her visits. But woven through the gratitude were details that made Harper uneasy. References to children no longer speaking at all. Mentions of night assemblies. And a recurring phrase, "They have begun to hear beneath the house." Harper traced the earliest letter to 1848, 1 year after the Whitmore fire. The latest was dated 1949. Over 100 years of influence. One woman. No aging. No documented lineage. No burial. Harper attempted to publish his findings in a theological journal. The article was rejected for lack of verifiable evidence. Within months, the crate went missing from the archive storage. Harper claimed he never removed it. The university denied its existence. But before it vanished, he copied one letter in full. It was addressed to a reverend in 1883, and in it, Eliza wrote, "The children must first be emptied of fear. Once empty, they will hear what waits. It has always waited. It waited before the house. It waited before the fields. It is patient." Harper left academia in 1954. Friends later said he became withdrawn. He refused to live in houses with crawl spaces. He never had children. And when asked why, he once replied quietly, "Some things are inherited through silence." In 1961, a demographer reviewing historical census data noticed statistical anomalies across several southern counties between 1850 and 1920. Clusters of missing adolescents. Small but consistent. Never enough to cause alarm in a single town. But when layered across regions, the pattern sharpened. The disappearances were subtle, often categorized as relocation, indenture, or clerical error. Yet in nearly every affected county, church guest records contained at least one signature of an Ward within 5 years prior to the spike. It was coincidence on paper, but coincidence repeated becomes structure. The demographer cross-referenced orphanage closures with guest lecturer records from seminaries. The overlap was undeniable. Institutions emphasizing behavioral purification saw increased child transfer rates, often undocumented. Where did the children go? Some resurfaced years later under new surnames. Others never appeared again in any state record. One 1902 orphanage ledger contained a chilling note beside a 12-year-old boy's name. Transferred beneath supervision. No receiving institution listed. Just that phrase. Transferred beneath. By the late 1960s, researchers speculated about underground adoption rings, religious cult movements, or unrecorded labor networks. But no financial trails surfaced. No ransom demands. No mass graves. The mystery defied conventional crime. Because it did not operate like crime. It operated like ritual. Slow. Generational. Hidden inside authority structures people trusted. Families. Churches. Schools. Places that promised safety. And in every layer of documentation, like a watermark pressed into history, was the quiet presence of a woman teaching children how to let go of themselves. Teaching them to stand still long enough to hear something older than their names. Something that did not need chains to bind them. Something that had waited beneath the Whitmore house long before it burned. In 1978, a 93-year-old woman named Clara Mitchell agreed to an oral history interview in a small Georgia town. She had grown up near Black Hollow Orphanage. Most of her memories were ordinary. Chores, Sunday service, summer heat. But when asked about the orphanage children, her hands began to tremble. She described seeing 3 siblings who didn't blink right. She remembered standing near them once at a well. No one else around. No wind. No birds. She said one of them turned to her and asked, "Do you want to be lighter?" Clara did not understand. She laughed nervously. The child leaned closer and whispered, "It's easier without all that inside." She asked what they meant. The child pointed to her chest. Clara avoided the orphanage after that. But one night, she woke to humming outside her bedroom window. Soft, measured, not a lullaby she recognized. She looked through the glass and saw a woman standing in the yard. Still, watching the house. Clara's father rushed outside with a lantern. No footprints, no figure. But Clara insisted the woman's face was calm. Not threatening, just certain. Clara never married. She told the interviewer, near the end of her life. They weren't taken screaming. That's what people don't understand. The ones who left, they walked. When asked where they walked to, Clara's answer was simple. Home. She died the following year. Her testimony was archived, rarely accessed, because it did not fit any official narrative. There were no crimes to prosecute, no cult leaders arrested, no conspiracies proven, just a pattern of children taught to empty themselves, and a presence that did not age. By the early 20th century, the language shifted. The doctrine of emptiness was no longer spoken of in religious terms. It reappeared in psychology, in reform education, in early behavioral conditioning studies. The terminology changed. Suppression of ego, behavioral correction, self-erasure for social harmony. Institutions praised quiet compliance as progress. Children praised for stillness, for not questioning, for adapting seamlessly. Some historians argue this was natural evolution in educational thought. But hidden within archived lecture notes from the 1934 seminary incident was a familiar phrase. Before filling the vessel, ensure it is hollow. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched samples from the Tulane archive. Eliza Ward may not have written textbooks. She may not have founded organizations. But ideas do not require credit to spread. They require repetition and authority. Across decades, her influence blended into structures of discipline. Not supernatural, not dramatic, just consistent. A belief that children are flawed by default, that identity is excess, that obedience is purity. If the Whitmore children survived and carried that teaching outward, if orphan siblings became mentors, if those mentored became leaders, then the doctrine was never a fringe belief. It became embedded, so deeply that by mid-century, no one remembered where it began. They only remembered that children should be quiet, that silence was good, that emptiness meant safety. But emptiness leaves space, and something had always been waiting to occupy it. The Whitmore house burned completely, records scattered, land abandoned. Yet the chamber beneath the nursery predated the plantation itself. Archaeologists in the 1980s attempted limited excavation of the sealed foundation. Funding was minimal, interest low, until ground-penetrating scans revealed something beneath the original chamber. Another void, deeper, older, natural limestone erosion, officials concluded. But a junior researcher wrote in her notes. The formations resembled deliberate shaping. Her report was never published. Excavation halted due to structural instability. The land remains fenced. No historical marker. No plaque. Nothing acknowledging what stood there. But locals still report odd experiences near the property line. Children becoming unusually quiet during field trips. Dogs refusing to cross certain areas. A faint humming on humid nights. No evidence supports these claims officially. Yet the pattern persists. The Whitmore fire was not an ending. It was an exposure. Henry Whitmore believed he was shaping perfect obedience. He believed he controlled the process. But his final letter revealed fear. He had emptied his children, and something answered the emptiness. Eliza Ward did not resist the process. She refined it, carried it, spread it through institutions trusted to guide the young. Whether she was human, myth, or symbol no longer matters, because the structure she nurtured remains. Whenever children are taught that their voice is excess, whenever identity is labeled weakness, whenever silence is praised above curiosity, the doctrine survives. And beneath every house built on forgotten ground, there is always the possibility that something patient is still waiting to be heard. In 1989, a rural county in Mississippi reopened 3 cold cases involving children who had vanished between 1910 and 1922. The decision wasn't driven by new evidence. It was driven by a single burial record. A small cemetery outside town had begun digitizing its graves. One headstone, dated 1964, carried a name long listed among the missing. Andrew Bell disappeared at age 11 in 1913. But the headstone marked his age at death as 62. How does a missing child die half a century later without anyone noticing he lived? Investigators located distant relatives. They described Andrew as a quiet boarder who arrived in town in the 1940s. He had no documentation prior to that decade. No birth certificate, no draft card, no marriage record. He rented a small house near the woods. Never married, never raised his voice. And neighbors remembered something strange. He would host gatherings for children, not large groups, just 2 or 3 at a time. Parents said he offered tutoring, discipline training, character refinement. The children who attended became subdued, more obedient. Some stopped laughing entirely. When Andrew died, the house was cleared quickly. Few possessions, no photographs, no family heirlooms. But under the floorboards of the back bedroom, workers found chalk markings, circles within squares, a house with no doors, and one phrase written repeatedly in uneven script. Make room. Handwriting analysis could not determine whether the markings were Andrew's or someone else's, but records confirmed that Andrew Bell had once been a resident at Black Hollow Orphanage, one of the children who vanished after the Hale siblings' arrival. He had not run away. He had not died. He had simply disappeared from the surface of history, then returned decades later, quiet, composed, and teaching. Psychologists studying generational trauma often speak of inherited patterns. Behavior passed not through blood, but through modeling. Fear shaping fear. Silence shaping silence. But what happens when silence is deliberate? When it is structured? When it is taught as virtue? In archived reform school manuals from the early 1900s, language emerges that mirrors Henry Whitmore's philosophy almost word for word. Remove excess emotional response. Discourage independent fantasy. Encourage uniform stillness. There is no mention of Eliza Ward, no reference to plantations, no acknowledgement of the Whitmore fire. And yet the lineage is visible, a belief that children must be hollowed before they can be guided. The danger of such belief is not supernatural. It is psychological. A child taught to erase themselves becomes easy to direct, easy to reshape, easy to recruit. Across decades, those shaped children grew into adults who valued obedience above empathy, control above curiosity, stillness above joy. The doctrine of emptiness no longer required a humming woman in the yard. It required institutions. And institutions are harder to burn than houses. The tragedy of the Whitmore children was not simply that they were emptied. It was that their emptiness became a template, passed quietly, embedded in policies, disguised as discipline. And when people ask why certain generations struggle to speak, why vulnerability feels unsafe, why silence is mistaken for strength, they rarely look back to forgotten chambers beneath nursery floors. They rarely ask who first decided that being human required subtraction. Some historians reject the supernatural reading entirely. They argue that the presence described in letters and testimonies was metaphor, a projection of guilt, a symbol of collective shame buried beneath plantation wealth. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps the chamber under the Whitmore nursery was nothing more than a hidden meeting space. Perhaps the symbols were invented by frightened children. Perhaps Eliza Ward was simply a woman forced into impossible circumstances, who survived by mastering control. But there remains one detail that resists metaphor: the chamber predating the house. If Henry built over something older, what was it? Native burial ground? Forgotten cellar? Abandoned root cave? Or something shaped long before records were kept? In 1997, a local surveyor mapping groundwater beneath the old property recorded unusual acoustic readings. Low-frequency vibrations, barely perceptible, consistent. He dismissed them as geological shifts. But he wrote in his private journal, "It sounds like resonance, like air moving through a hollow space." The land remains undisturbed, no development permitted, not because of ghosts, but because of unstable foundation. And perhaps that is the truest explanation of all. The foundation was unstable, not only the soil, but the belief system built upon it. A plantation owner attempting to purify his children. A woman forced to carry out a doctrine that reshaped generations. A community that chose silence over scrutiny. Something waited beneath that house. Whether it was guilt, trauma, or something less definable, it fed on emptiness. And emptiness was carefully cultivated. History often preserves wars and presidents. It forgets nurseries. It forgets small rooms where ideas are tested on the powerless. The Whitmore fire became a footnote in county records. A tragic accident. A mystery unsolved. But the deeper story was never about flames. It was about control disguised as care. About the belief that love requires removal. About institutions that valued stillness over truth. When communities face uncomfortable histories, they sanitize them. They rename doctrines. They remove individual names. They bury letters in mislabeled crates. They let archives disappear. Because acknowledging the full story would require asking difficult questions. How many children were shaped in silence? How many adults carry emptiness they never chose? How many systems still reward the absence of self? Eliza Ward may have been one woman, or she may have been a symbol, an embodiment of survival twisted into replication. But the trail she left behind is real. Letters, signatures, witnesses, chambers sealed beneath foundations. The children who walked away did not scream. They did not fight. They walked willingly, because they had been taught that surrender was purity. And when surrender becomes virtue, resistance feels like sin. That is the most enduring horror of all. Not something lurking in darkness, but something encouraged in daylight.